Hi, welcome back to Behind the Unicorn. I'm Emily Davis. This is the podcast where we talk about how not for profit businesses actually and really work. In this episode, I wanted to talk about nonprofit startups, nonprofit creation. And it feels like a good place to start since I am starting my podcast and I'm creating something new. So, why not start talking about nonprofits and how people create them, why they create them, and things to really think about before you create them? I get a lot of requests from folks who want to quote unquote pick my brain about starting a nonprofit. And I actually, a number of years ago, created a very specific Pick Emily's Brain service that you can find on my website for advice for nonprofit creation. The reason I bring this up is because many times, I would say about 50% of the time, when people reach out to me about picking my brain for nonprofit startup consulting or advice, they often will not follow through with a Pick Emily's Brain session because they say, well, we don't have the money to pay for that kind of advice or consulting. And I think this is, which is fine. And I think this is a great example of one of the problems with starting a nonprofit. And that is you need resources, people, time, and money to start a business of any kind. But for some reason, the way the culture of nonprofits have evolved, there is a common misunderstanding that nonprofits don't cost money, that you can't make money. All of these things really lead to a misunderstanding that nonprofits are, in fact, businesses. And the analogy I often give people when they come to me for nonprofit startup advice is you wouldn't start an Italian restaurant just because you like pasta. We all have passions, we have hobbies, we things that we're truly invested in knowing about, learning about, maybe are even experts in. But that doesn't necessarily mean we would start a business. And in the case of the Italian restaurant example, to start any kind of restaurant, you want to have some business acumen and you want to hire and bring in people who can complement your business acumen. And so that is a smart way to start a business. Also, knowing that it's going to cost money to start that business, whether it's a bricks and mortar location, food, supplies, paying people, it costs money. And somehow, when we get to nonprofits, we often act as though, listen, I want to start the Pet Rock Foundation, and I know there's other people passionate about the Pet Rock Foundation. So it's just going to work out. And there isn't really a plan. Or folks will say, we have something we're really passionate about. It's of great service to the community, and we want to get 501c3 status so we can get grants from foundations. That is not a sustainable business model. And oftentimes, because people don't understand the nonprofit sector and fundraising and revenue generation for nonprofits, this is their default is I need 501c3 status so I can get grants to pay for whatever it might be, which I'll talk about a little bit more. If someone or a group of people do not have the money to pay for expertise, whether it's somebody like me or legal expertise or planning expertise or any number of things, then you're probably not ready to start a nonprofit. The tax exemption status is just a tax status. It does nothing for helping anyone run the business. And so when I sit down with folks and talk to them about what they need to think about when they're starting a nonprofit, I tell them the easy part are the programs and services. That's the part everybody gets excited about. But that is not what sustains the organization. It's just one part of it. I always recommend people learn about, if nothing else, things like board governance, because you're legally required, if you have tax exempt status, you're legally required to have a board. And that board needs to be made up of volunteers. So people who are not paid, and they should not be, I repeat, they should not be friends and family. If you are the founder of the nonprofit, you also have to serve either as the board chair or the staff lead, executive director, CEO. You cannot be both. I'll talk about that more later. But for now, you need to know enough about board governance to understand how to engage your board, what their roles and responsibilities are, so that you can recruit them to your new nonprofit so they can set themselves up for success and do the job that they're being asked to do. If you want to learn more about that, BoardSource is a great resource on that topic. So board governance is something that I really think people need to learn about before they start a nonprofit. I'm not saying you need to be an expert, but you need to understand the basic about what board roles are and what they're not. The other thing that I think is critical is fundraising. And I often refer to fundraising as the F word because people don't like it and they fundamentally don't understand what fundraising is. Fundraising at its core is revenue generation for nonprofits. That's it. But unlike for-profits, most nonprofits are not selling a product or a service unless they're fee for service. Think about like a hospital, or they have something called social enterprise, where they sell a product or a service as part of their revenue model that's directly connected to their mission, which is also a whole nother conversation. Lots of podcast episodes coming up on all of these things. Nonprofits really have two buckets under which they can generate revenue. There's contributed income and there's earned income. And earned income is what I just talked about. Things like fee for service, social enterprise. Contributed income comes from a whole variety of potential sources. Individuals, grants, and those can be private foundation, public foundation, government grants, corporate grants, can come from corporate sponsorships, events, uh, certain clubs like Kiwanis Club or Rotary. There's all these different ways to generate revenue. And in many ways, it's more complex than a for-profit business for that reason alone. So when starting a not-for-profit company, I like to talk to people particularly about revenue generation and understanding all the different categories under which a nonprofit could bring in income in order to do the work that they want to do. And nonprofits and their boards need to understand enough about each one of those categories to be able to say, we will or maybe we won't raise money from any of those particular categories. Another layer to this, which we'll talk about a lot in terms of fundraising, is that within those contributed and earned income umbrellas, we also have unrestricted, restricted, and temporarily restricted funding. Listen, they just don't have that in the nonprofit world. And what the gold standard is, the thing that we all want in nonprofit businesses, is unrestricted funding. Meaning I give you $100 and you use that $100 however is best going to serve your mission. That might mean it goes towards paying a salary of somebody that you hired as an expert to do fundraising. And ultimately, that's going to help your programs and services thrive and ultimately help you serve your mission. So unrestricted is what we're always going for because it gives us the greatest flexibility to do what we need in terms of serving our mission and doing the work we want to do. And when we get unrestricted dollars as nonprofits, it sends the message, we trust you to do what's best for the not-for-profit business. The vast majority of unrestricted dollars in philanthropy comes from individuals, not foundation grants, not corporate grants, not sponsorships from corporations, not government grants. It comes from individuals. And fundraising from individuals is crucial to sustainability, which I'll talk about more in a minute. However, most people think of fundraising as begging people for money. And if you think that all fundraising is asking people for money, you need to flip the script, because it's actually the ask part is only really a small percentage of the overall fundraising process. Because fundraising is relationship building, it's authentic relationship building, it's bringing people to closer to the inner circle of your organization. So, where we get the most unrestricted dollars in the nonprofit world comes from individuals, and individuals aren't ATMs. So, we need to understand the overall fundraising process to be able to bring individuals into the organization, and therefore those unrestricted dollars into the organization. Now, where you get to restricted funding is more along the lines of, say, corporate grants, private, family, public foundation grants, and federal grants. And so, what do those look like? Not just federal, state, all government grants. You can generally expect those to be heavily restricted, either permanently or temporarily. What does that mean? That means that, generally speaking, like a foundation grant will say, we're going to give you, you have to apply for the grant. Listen, grants take a long time to find out if you get them. And they're usually not very reliable, because funders can change their priorities at any time. That's their right to do that. But that means that you may get a grant for over let's say you have a $30,000 grant that you get $10,000 a year from that grant. Once that grant's up, there's not necessarily any guarantees that you would get another grant. And funders can change their priorities. So they may not be funding organizations like yours into the future. So in a temporarily restricted grant like this, is that it may be that you can use some of the funds, right? Like if you have that $30,000 grant, you can use $10,000 in the first year, $10,000 in the second, and $10,000 in the third. So some of it's restricted for a certain amount of time. Permanently restricted is you always have to use it, for a specific thing and a specific time. It's restricted. The money is very specifically restricted in a specific way. Most grants, foundation grants, are generally, and this is not always true, it's changing, thank goodness, but generally don't pay for things like staff. And so nonprofits have to do a lot of extra work to get unrestricted money to pay for the expertise to actually implement the work. It doesn't happen by magic. Or it might not pay for an entire salary. So there's a this is sort of a side note here, but Dan Pallotta, a number of years ago, came out with a book called Uncharitable, and he has a YouTube video of a talk that he did that's called "The Way We Think About Charity is Dead Wrong." And it's stuff that all of us have been saying for decades, but it's really debunking the idea of overhead in nonprofits, because there really isn't overhead. Nonprofits generally run very lean. And even when you get to larger, more institutional nonprofits, they're still running pretty efficiently for the most part. The bigger you get, any kind of business, generally you're going to have more inefficiencies because you just have more people. And hello, humans are messy and inefficient. However, a lot of times foundations, government grants, they will see, supplies and people is quote unquote overhead, which is fundamentally wrong because we cannot do our work we can do our work. We might not do it well, but we can do our work. But if we don't have great people who do the work well, it's just going to be inefficient and we're not going to be able to meet our mission as well. So you need money to do that. And so understanding the ways that we bring in revenue, right? Going back to those buckets of unrestricted and restricted revenue, and unrestricted revenue, temporarily restricted revenue, and permanently restricted revenue, as well as contributed and earned income, and then all the categories that fall underneath those things. We in starting a nonprofit need to understand enough about fundraising and nonprofit revenue generation to know where we're going to put our eggs, how much in each basket. And that's your development plan. That's your fundraising plan. That's your business plan. A lot of times, folks won't understand this and it really be, and I think this is true of every element of nonprofit creation, is it's really a ready, fire, aim approach rather than ready, aim, fire. And so conversations like this one become really important. I'll have folks come to me and say, we've hired an attorney to do our tax filings to start our nonprofit. And so we're in really good shape. And my response to that is always, good job. The easy part's done. And that's true. And a lot of times people will hire an attorney to file the paperwork to incorporate, but then they will not think about the resources they need to successfully run a business. You need both. And frankly, if I'm being honest, because that's my job on this podcast, filling out the paperwork isn't hard. But there are things like you have to identify your board of directors, I would highly recommend not just putting down names of friends and family, but planning that out before you file the paperwork. Things like that. The other thing that is really important before considering starting yet another nonprofit, whether it's a 501c3, C4, C6, there's 26 different tax designations under nonprofit tax exemption. So we'll talk about that a different time because yikes. But before you start a nonprofit, the other thing is to do an environmental scan. Look at what other nonprofits exist in your community that either are local, they're statewide, they're even national or international. Look at what other nonprofits exist and how you could either learn from them, model from them, talk to their leadership to learn more, or how maybe you could avoid creating or replicating a nonprofit that already exists. And you could even add to and support an existing nonprofit if you do your environmental scan to see what's already out there. And I'll use that Italian restaurant example again. Let's say I want to start this Italian restaurant. Well, one of the things I would naturally look at is in my community, how many Italian restaurants already exist? What makes ours different? What do we need to have a different location? Do we need to have a particular kind of menu? How are we going to differentiate ourselves from others? What's our unique value proposition? It's no different than nonprofits. We have to show how we're unique and special. And I'll tell you what, here's the key. The key is to run your business better than any of those organizations. It's not just about the services we provide. If we do not build out the infrastructure and all of the supporting pieces of a business, we cannot deliver those programs and services and serve our mission effectively. It falls apart. It happens all the time. There's plenty of, we've all seen plenty of restaurants that don't work out. And a lot of times it's because the business calculations weren't right, either internally or something externally happened. I think we can learn a lot in terms of starting nonprofit businesses and looking at scanning the the environment, the ecosystem to see what else exists. One of the things I just mentioned is that your nonprofit idea might be supportive of an existing nonprofit. What do I mean by that? Well, you don't want to duplicate services. I'm all in favor of competition. If you think you have an idea that's going to do better than the other nonprofits doing the same kind of thing and you really have done your homework, great. Competition is not bad. But collaboration is really important in nonprofits. And there's something called fiscal sponsorship, which a lot of people aren't aware of when they go to start a nonprofit. The thought is always, we have to start an independent 501c3 organization. You don't. You can start something called fiscal sponsorship, which has a lot of nuance to it as well. But a fiscally sponsored organization is essentially, and this is very general because it's very nuanced, is a program of an existing nonprofit. So really, and listen, I've started nonprofits that are fiscally sponsored, and it was awesome because we really got to focus on doing the work that we like to do. We didn't have to worry about the legal and financial oversight that board members have. We did not have to do a lot of accounting, all of those things. We really got to focus on the whole reason we wanted to exist. And so being essentially a program out of another organization, their board is legally and financially responsible for the organization, the fiscal sponsor, and you and your project. You can have a different name. You don't have to be, the same name or even be listed as a project of X, Y, and Z nonprofit. You can have your own name. So the board takes that legal and financial oversight responsibility. They also, you also are part of their financial over their accounting, right? They have to do all the accounting to make sure things are in the up and up. And so they do that. Typically, they will have a fee. The nonprofit that's overseeing your organization will have a fee because that costs money and it costs time to do, right? Is to provide that fiscal sponsorship. But the trade offs can be really great because you don't have to independently take the risk of doing all these other things. You could be part of an organization that's already established this. Two caveats. One is you want a fiscal sponsorship agreement before moving forward. Two, you want to make sure that the organization that is providing all of that oversight knows what they're doing. Either they've done fiscal sponsorship before. I mean, we have an organization here in Colorado where its entire purpose as a nonprofit is to provide fiscal sponsorship for nonprofits. I would love to see more of that throughout the country. I think it is an awesome model. These individual organizations are all under the heading of it's called the Colorado Nonprofit Development Center here. And so they do all their own fundraising, but there's a back office that's being managed by this other overarching nonprofit. They have their own board, the whole thing. It's lovely. It's a great model. And it really helps with avoiding duplication. So fiscal sponsorship is its own conversation, as are many things I've already mentioned here, but it's worth some folks digging into and it can be a stepping stone, right? It's a really nice on-ramp between being an unregistered entity and being a standalone 501c3, C4, C6. Those are the most common ones. That's why I refer to them. Standalone nonprofit it's a nice middle to say, okay, we're not quite ready to have the full infrastructure. We want to do these programs. We want to do them well. We want to buy ourselves some time to build all of this out. But we also need some of that oversight and some of the benefits that come from being a tax exempt organization. So, fiscal sponsorship is another one. So far, what I have mentioned in terms of nonprofit creation is making sure there are financial, time, and human resources to get the expertise needed to really consider and build out a not for profit business, making sure you understand some of the basics around board governance and revenue generation. Now, there's a lot more to be said, but those are the two biggest ones, in my humble opinion, that folks need to know about before they incorporate as a nonprofit. And then the last thing is looking at fiscal sponsorship as an alternative. When people come to me about nonprofit startups, what I say to them is that nonprofits are harder to run than for profit businesses. And most of the time, hence the name of this podcast, people think it's all unicorns and rainbows. However, nonprofits also have bills to pay. We do not run on unicorns and rainbows. We have to have cash to do our work, and there's strategy behind that. So, hope is not a business strategy. If it was, boy, we probably would have solved a lot of problems by now. And so I always tell people too that nonprofits are held to a higher standard, as we should be. Part of being tax exempt means that you get benefits and breaks. And so the reason we actually have legally are required to have a board of directors, that these are members of the public overseeing the mission and the work of the nonprofit to make sure it's being adhered to, done properly. There are some mistakes in there, there's some faults. It's not a perfect system, but that's the whole purpose, is that we're held to a higher standard. And so I wouldn't start a nonprofit just because you have a great idea. You really want to test it out. Make sure you have those resources in place and that there's a structure that works for you and your team to be sustainable. I will often tell people, and I jokingly say this, but I mean it, that I'm going to give you the real deal here about starting a nonprofit. I may be a crusher of dreams, but the truth is that if I tell you all of this stuff and I give you all of these warnings and I ask you to consider all these different pieces of starting a nonprofit and you still want to do it, you're in good shape. It's important to be realistic about nonprofits as a business. It's important to surround yourself with people who complement your knowledge base. Listen, it's not possible to be an expert in everything. It takes time. And, we learn as we go. But being open and having a sense of curiosity and even being prepared for the idea of not what if this doesn't work, but what if it does work? What if your business, your not for profit business, grows really fast and you're not ready for it? The last thing I'm going to say about this for now, because I'm sure I'm going to talk about this a ton. The last thing I'll say for now is that if you are the founder of a nonprofit, you need to plan your exit strategy from the start. The nonprofit is not your business. As soon as you become a tax exempt organization, you are accountable to the public. You no longer own the business. The public is who you answer to. Therefore, I recommend founders always start with succession planning from the beginning. Organization goes through various life cycle stages, and they're going to need different leadership at different times. The nonprofits that I've started, I have always planned for me to be out of the founder role in 2 to 3 years. It's totally possible. With really good planning and thought, you can do it. And knowing that a lot of founders will stay way too long and oftentimes needs a consultant to come and coach them out of their job. It's very personal to start a nonprofit or any business, which I completely get. And at some point, you should go bye-byes. Go start another nonprofit. Go do something else. But it's really important for the long-term success and sustainability of the organization that it is not entirely reliant on the founder and vice versa, that the founder's identity isn't completely wrapped up in the nonprofit. That's a tall ask, but it's my job to tell you the truth about the things you need to think about if you're thinking about starting a nonprofit. We've pulled back the curtain on that one. And these are all topics that you can and recommendations that you can dive into further and learn more about. There's books on starting nonprofits. Those things are oftentimes going to be, the filing, the paperwork, so on and so forth. I've actually been working for years on writing a second book called How Not to Start a Nonprofit and all the alternatives to nonprofit creation. You don't have to start a 501c3 to do good work. So we talked about fiscal sponsorship. We'll talk about other models in coming episodes like donor advised funds. If you want more strategic giving, you can have a small business that is benefiting the community. There's even B Corps now. They're called benefit corporations. There's all different kinds of things out there. They might be buried and they might not be the first thing you think of, but I recommend doing the research to learn more about the alternatives to starting a 501c3. It's a big commitment. Understanding the revenue model, understanding board governance, understanding how to engage and support volunteers. This is hard. It's hard work. And to quote another podcast, we can do hard things and make sure you're ready for it. And make sure that you have an exit strategy. So there's less drama and more sustainability and greater impact. Having said all of that for the last 32 minutes, I would love to hear what your experiences are, what your questions are, and maybe I'll get a chance to follow up and answer some of those questions. With that, thank you so much for listening and watching. I'll have another episode out here soon, but this is a great start to a conversation. There is always more to talk about. So thanks for joining me for Behind the Unicorn, and I can't wait to see you next time.